Just because you saw the movie doesn't mean you know the truth. When it comes to these legendary artists, their real-life stories had more than a few deleted scenes.
Queen biopic Bohemian Rhapsody did plenty of playing with the truth, but the movie's fabrications are only half as bad as the things it totally left out. Here's how Bohemian Rhapsody ignored the true story of Queen. That scene where Freddie Mercury meets his future bandmates and wows them with his singing voice is good for a meet-cute, but that's not really how it all went down. The movie leaves out the fact that Freddie Mercury, Brian May, and Roger Taylor actually knew each other before they were all a band together. In real life, Mercury was also friends with Tim Staffel, the dude who quits the band in a huff in Bohemian Rhapsody. The truth is, there was no ugly incident preceding Staffel's departure. Staffel himself wrote in Esquire, "My departure from Smile was completely amicable. Freddie and I were good friends at college. Freddie joining the band was very natural, as he was really good friends with the band members before I left and simply dovetailed in. In fact, these guys were all part of a close-knit group of musicians who were constantly joining and quitting each other's bands." Staffel wrote, "You couldn't separate the social aspect from the musical aspect. So we had a big pool of musical friends that would combine and recombine, trying different band ideas out. Freddie socialized with us, we socialized with Freddie. Eventually, they hit on just the right combo, and the rest is history, just not quite as Bohemian Rhapsody tells it." Bohemian Rhapsody totally skims over the fact that Queen went through 3 other bassists before John Deacon finally joined the band. In the film, Deacon joins Queen almost immediately after Mercury does, but in reality, it took a lot longer than that. According to a 1996 profile of Deacon in Bassist and Bass Techniques magazine, Deacon hit it off with the band partly thanks to his quiet demeanor and less than flamboyant playing style. Queen's previous bass players were reportedly too showy in their performance styles, drawing attention away from the other band members, the opposite of what they wanted in a bassist. But the eventual union between Queen and Deacon still wasn't love at first sight. Deacon saw Queen perform in October 1970 and reportedly did not find them to be that interesting of a band. But then in early 1971, a mutual friend formally introduced Deacon to May and Taylor, and for some reason, Deacon had a change of heart. Once he joined up with the group, Deacon became known as the yin to the other's yang. Roger Taylor would later tell the Daily Mail, "We were so used to each other and so over the top, we thought that because he was quiet, he would fit in with us without too much upheaval." He was a great bass player, too.
Cheers!
In the film, Queen sells their touring van so they can afford to make their first album. Shortly after that, they meet their new manager, John Reed, and everything suddenly falls into place. But the film skipped over a ton of drama that happened before they got to that point. In real life, the band didn't sell a van, they sold their souls. Well, kind of. Queen's first manager wasn't John Reed, but a man called Norman Sheffield, co-owner of Trident Studios. According to The Guardian, after Queen's album Sheer Heart Attack made it to number 2, the band was left wondering why they weren't rolling in cash. As it turns out, it was because they'd signed a somewhat predatory contract with Trident, which basically said Queen would make the albums and Trident would sell them to EMI, meaning there wouldn't be enough money left over for the band to buy a new set of drumsticks, much less anything else. The band was so angry about the arrangement that they wrote a super unflattering ode to Sheffield called Death on Two Legs, dedicated to. That song was so harsh that Brian May even later admitted he felt bad singing it. It called Sheffield, among other things, a sewer rat decaying in a cesspool of pride, and angered the band's former manager so much that he decided to sue Queen and EMI for defamation of character. Paul Printer is the undisputed villain of Bohemian Rhapsody. He keeps Mercury locked away in his own mansion, answers all of his calls for him, shuns all of his friends, and is implied to be the reason why Mercury contracted HIV. But the extent of the real Paul Printer's villainy is debatable. It is true that he sold Mercury out to the media in 1987, but the idea that Mercury was isolated and shut away by Printer is almost totally fictional. In reality, Mercury definitely didn't spend all his time in his home waiting for Printer to bring the party to him. He had a whole entourage of people and spent plenty of time with them at nightclubs and parties. In those days, his entourage included not just Paul Printer, but the likes of actor Peter Straker, Elton John, and Princess Diana. The movie doesn't show any of that, though, because it would have jumbled the narrative and turned Printer into a more watered-down villain. And at some point in every film, you gotta have somebody to hate. Bohemian Rhapsody, the song, not the movie, was Queen's crowning achievement. Sure, they did a lot of great stuff afterward, but nothing would ever quite match the epic scale of that 6-minute operatic rock suite that gave the film its title. And like many great works of art, Bohemian Rhapsody didn't really come together over the course of a few days. In the film, we see Mercury tapping out the first notes on his piano, but we don't see any of the flashes of inspiration that came before all that. According to Rock Music Revival, Mercury started writing Bohemian Rhapsody in college. The famous opening words, "Mama just killed a man," were the first to come to mind and led Mercury to think of it under the temporary title of the Cowboy Song. The band started working on the song together in 1975. The operatic sessions took 70 hours to record and happened not just in that one studio in the muddy middle of nowhere, but in 5 different studios, and that was just for the vocals. One thing the movie did portray correctly was the song's reception, and many of Queen's contemporaries reacted exactly the way Mike Myers' fictional character did.
These words, if they're not careful, by the end of the year, no one will know the name Queen.
But Queen wouldn't back down, the song remained uncut, and music history was made. In the movie, Mary Austin insists to Mercury that he's gay, and from that point onwards, the movie continues by portraying Mercury as a man who is only interested in men. While this may have simplified the narrative a bit, it was far from the whole story. In reality, Mercury was a lot more complicated than that. The truth is that he didn't just go on to have relationships with men alone, but also with women, and the film excluded all of the latter. According to biography, Mercury had a number of relationships with men, including Jim Hutton, who does actually have a part in Bohemian Rhapsody. During the 1980s, however, he also had a relationship with German actress Barbara Valentine. The two met in Munich and even shared an apartment, although, to be fair, she would later describe him as, quote, mostly gay. Of course, her presence in the film would have complicated the more simplistic narrative the filmmakers had in mind, so instead of telling Mercury's story in all of its romantically complex glory, they opted to let viewers believe that Mercury was strictly gay. In Bohemian Rhapsody, Freddie Mercury is depicted as focusing on a single musical pursuit, Queen, with a short sidetrack for some solo stuff. In reality, however, Mercury collaborated with many other artists and musicians, including a famous opera singer named Montserrat Caballé. Mercury met Caballé in 1987, and their creative union produced one of the world's most influential marriages of classical and contemporary music, the anthem Barcelona. That's probably not especially shocking though, since even Queen newcomers will know about Mercury's fondness for opera. It's a huge part of the Bohemian Rhapsody song, after all. What might surprise even Queen fans, however, is that Mercury also performed with the Royal Ballet, though he did require a little convincing before he agreed to take part. After initially thinking they must have been mad to consider him, Mercury was eventually convinced to perform after speaking with the head of EMI, who was also chairman of the Royal Ballet's Board of Governors. You don't become a ballet dancer overnight, though, and Mercury later recalled his punishing practice sessions in the London Evening News. He said of his training, "It was murder. After 2 days, I was in agony. It was hurting me in places I didn't know I had, dear." Mercury made his ballet debut in October 1979 in front of an audience of 2,500 theater patrons. He told the London Evening News, "I wasn't quite Baryshnikov, but it wasn't bad for an aging beginner. I'd like to see Mick Jagger or Rod Stewart try that." It's not just his side projects outside of the arena rock realm that Bohemian Rhapsody leaves out. The movie also doesn't really touch on any of Mercury's many musical collaborations with artists in the rock genre, or the friendships he forged with some of the greatest musicians of his time. You probably already know that he was acquainted with David Bowie, if only because of Under Pressure, Queen's iconic collaborative song with the Thin White Duke. But they didn't just meet as fellow rock stars. Mercury's relationship with Bowie went all the way back to his college years when Bowie played a gig at Mercury's university, and Mercury helped him push a bunch of desks together to make a stage. Mercury recorded with other big names too, including Michael Jackson. In 1983, the pair worked together on the songs There Must Be More to Life Than This, State of Shock, and Victory, but the songs were never released. Why? Because of a llama. Yes, the recording sessions were interrupted by Jackson's pet llama, and Mercury couldn't take it, finally calling manager Jim Beach and begging to be rescued. He told Beach, "You gotta get me out of here. I'm recording with a llama. I've had enough and I want to get out." Freddie Mercury's decline was slow and quiet. Practically none of it is depicted in Bohemian Rhapsody because producers decided to give the film a triumphant ending rather than a tragic one. In real life, Mercury's AIDS diagnosis didn't actually come until 2 years after the iconic Live Aid performance, and he lived for another 4 years after that. So while the movie's ending may feel inspiring, it's also one of the movie's most misleading distortions, potentially affecting how audiences view the legendary real-life concert. Like many of the movie's distortions, it's based on a kernel of truth. Years after the Live Aid performance, when Queen made an appearance at the 1990 Brit Awards, Mercury was gaunt and pale and said little to the audience. Outside of the public eye, however, Mercury kept on working. Brian May later explained to The Telegraph, Freddie wanted his life to be as normal as possible. For him, the studio was an oasis, a place where life was just the same as it always had been. He loved making music. He lived for it. According to The Telegraph, Mercury kept recording until he could no longer do it. His last session was in May 1991, and the last song he recorded was Made in Heaven's Mother Love, recorded between the 13th and the 16th of that month. But at that point in his life, he was very sick. May explained, "We got as far as the penultimate verse and he said, 'I'm not feeling that great. I'll finish it when I come back next time.' But of course, he didn't ever come back to the studio after that." Mercury died in November of that same year, and Brian May sang the last verse of Mother Love. In the world of rock biopics that gloss over the more unsavory aspects of their subjects, the supposed honesty of Motley Crue's The Dirt is refreshing. But even a good movie can't keep everything in. Here are parts of Motley Crue's story that The Dirt ignores. Early on in The Dirt, we see Motley Crue gleefully fighting during their first concert. Though it's played largely for laughs, it establishes the idea that Motley Crue is a band that'll happily throw some punches, apart from Mick Mars. He remains on stage with his guitar, though he does get a kick in. Later on in the movie, drummer Tommy Lee punches a confrontational girlfriend on a tour bus, and everyone, including Lee, reacts with dazed shock. These scenes make it appear like The Dirt fearlessly depicts the band members' most violent instincts. In reality, the movie pulls quite a few punches. It certainly doesn't show just how comfortable most Motley Crue members were when it came to hurting people. Vince Neil has allegedly assaulted women multiple times. In fact, actor Nicolas Cage once had to intervene during one of Neil's alleged altercations. Tommy Lee was sued for assaulting a photographer in 2013. As E! Online notes, he was also sentenced to 6 months in jail for spousal battery in 1998 after a nasty scuffle with Pamela Anderson. Although Nikki Sixx's destructive tendencies were mostly aimed at himself, Rock Candy magazine reports that he once got himself and his manager arrested by throwing a bottle at a man's head in a bullet train from Osaka to Tokyo. The most glaring character omission from The Dirt is arguably actress Pamela Anderson, whose turbulent relationship with drummer Tommy Lee would probably have sparked a lawsuit or 9 had it been featured in the movie.
Why do bad things happen to good people?
Still, while Anderson is noticeably absent from the film, she definitely left an impression on more than one band member in real life. As Vince Neil is all too happy to share in his autobiography, Tattoos and Tequila, Anderson briefly dated him before she got together with Lee. But Neil's brief involvement with Anderson is nothing compared to her scandal-ridden marriage to Tommy Lee. They became one of the most famous couples in the world and managed to make waves wherever they went. They also inadvertently starred in what's generally considered the most famous celebrity sex tape of all time. And as we mentioned, the couple had an intensely ugly falling out. Absolutely none of this is touched upon in The Dirt. As MTV News reports, Tommy Lee found himself in a strange predicament in 1999. He evidently thought his glam metal days were behind him and decided to try his hand at something else. That something else turned out to be hip-hop. He put together a rap metal act called Methods of Mayhem and started collaborating with such artists as Snoop Dogg, Busta Rhymes, and even Limp Bizkit's Fred Durst. We imagine this strange career turn was omitted from The Dirt because it would have caused a lot of undue confusion. Plus, Lee reportedly got the idea for Methods of Mayhem during his 6-month jail sentence, so it sounds like a potential plot point that would have been worthy of a veto for a number of reasons. John Corabi's fate in Motley Crue is that of the classic new guy. Fans never really warmed up to him, and he was quietly phased out when Vince Neil returned to the fold in 1997 for the Generation Swine album. As Corabi told Rock by Wild in 2012,
I was in Motley, and I never knew that they were going to bring Vince back. You know, so things have a way of life just has a way of working itself out.
The Dirt deems him such an unimportant piece of Motley Crue lore that we only briefly see him on screen, and he never utters a single word. As Raw Music TV notes, Corabi actually offered more to the band than a goofy grin and a lackluster album. In fact, the publication claims the new singer outright saved Motley Crue from fading into irrelevance. When Neil left the band in 1992, Motley Crue tried to produce a worthy follow-up to its most commercially successful album, Dr. Feelgood. But in the context of the era, this proved to be an impossible feat. Grunge music was rapidly showing hair metal the door, and artists such as Poison and Rat were quickly finding out that their brand of rock just didn't have legs anymore. Corabi ushered in a different songwriting style, forcing the band out of their comfort zone. Unfortunately, his fellow band members undermined this new injection of creativity with a bunch of awful mistakes, like firing their manager, lawyers, and accountants while attempting to produce the record themselves. But Corabi was reportedly never an issue for them, and they liked him so much they wanted to keep him around despite the 1994 album's lack of success. Until Neil returned, that is. The Dirt devotes some time establishing Motley Crue as a band that thinks about their image pretty carefully, if drunkenly. That's why it's not exactly a surprise that the movie never mentions the time they turned in a miscalculated music video that got them banned by MTV. The lyrics to the 1987 single You're All I Need are particularly vicious, and Motley Crue decided to double down in the video. It depicts a doomed, destructive relationship and features the man trashing their home and ultimately killing his significant other. As you can see, much of the video was shot in the matter-of-fact style of a news story. Let it suffice to say, the clip didn't go over well with MTV executives who banned it from the channel. Nikki Sixx later admitted that the song's dark lyrics were inspired by his own failing relationship with a girlfriend he was convinced had been cheating on him. Sixx says he dealt with the situation by writing You're All I Need, playing it to his now ex-girlfriend, and dramatically walking out of the door when she started crying. According to The Dirt, guitarist Mick Mars first met Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee during an audition, and he quickly proved that he was the right man for the job.
Listen to me. There's only room for one guitar player in this band, and that's me.
However, the movie conveniently ignores the fact that the real Mars and Sixx had met long before that, even if they didn't realize it at the time. In 1978, Sixx was reportedly working at a liquor store when who should walk in but Mick Mars. According to Loudwire, the guitar player had a gig with his band White Horse at a nearby venue called Stone Pony. He allegedly snuck away to grab a bottle of tequila because the Pony's $2 shots were just too pricey. Mars reportedly recognized Sixx as a fellow rocker and struck up a discussion asking what bands he liked. Unfortunately, Sixx's answer included Kiss, which didn't impress Mars at all, but the guitarist still invited the kid to White Horse's concert. After Sixx finished his shift, he reportedly got wasted and walked into the bar, only to witness the magnificent sight of Mars grinding out a guitar solo by using a microphone stand as a slide. The highly impressed Sixx hung out until the very end, and the two later resumed talking. Mars even drunkenly gave Sixx his phone number. However, the chance encounter never led anywhere until years later when the guitarist happened to join his drinking buddy's band. The Dirt doesn't hesitate to show us some of Motley Crue's more inspired rock star behavior. In the same way 80s action films have training montages, The Dirt has a montage that's dedicated exclusively to the band destroying hotel rooms and terrorizing people.
Wow, this is a nice place. Time to redecorate.
The movie has a tendency to gloss over these antics as Boys Will Be Boys misadventures, and the band doesn't really suffer any consequences beyond massive hangovers the next morning. Really, cop cars only seem to turn up for the real life and death stuff, namely when Vince Neil crashes his car and kills the Hanoi Rocks drummer Nicholas Razzle Dingley. Of course, in the real world, it's very easy to get in trouble for Motley Crue's brand of obnoxious behavior. Apart from the more serious stuff that landed Motley Crue members in hot water, they've also been involved in a fair share of bizarre lawsuits over the years. In 1999, MTV reported that Motley Crue harassed a security guard during a concert and almost started a riot. In 2016, Metal Sucks reported that a supporting band sued Motley Crue for assorted shenanigans, including members of the Crue entourage spraying urine at them. And yet, when the band is forced to face consequences for their actions, they evidently prove to be rather thin-skinned. In 2005, MTV reported that Motley Crue was suing NBC. Why? Because the network reportedly banned the band after they dropped an F-bomb during a live Tonight Show broadcast on New Year's Eve. The Dirt presents Motley Crue as a rather amazing live act, so it's not particularly surprising that the movie chooses to ignore all the times their rock concerts took a decidedly nasty turn. For example, in 1985, a 13-year-old fan was reportedly partially blinded during a concert in Alabama. That's because something, possibly a chunk of dry ice from malfunctioning equipment, flew into his eye. The 1988 trial was reportedly heated and difficult. As president of the band's business affairs, Nikki Sixx was in town for the duration of the proceedings. His stay was reportedly something right out of a fish-out-of-water movie. Following his near-fatal 1987 overdose, Sixx had reportedly straightened himself out somewhat. Instead of an outlandish rock star, the locals reportedly found a friendly, super-famous, nice guy who offered lifesaver candies to fans. He even struck up an oddball friendship with a local lawyer. Sixx gave the lawyer guitar pointers, and the lawyer taught Sixx how to tie a necktie. The case ultimately ended in a mistrial, and Motley Crue later settled out of court. The Dirt is based on the book of the same name, a book that has certainly added to Motley Crue's notoriety thanks to its avalanche of filthy rock stories. But wouldn't it be strange if much of the memoir was built on untruths? We're not saying it was, because we don't need to. As Loudwire reports, Nikki Sixx has basically admitted as much himself. In 2019, Sixx was in hot water over a story in the book that described a wild party. That party evidently ended with Sixx and Tommy Lee committing sexual assault on a woman by fooling her into switching partners mid-act. The bass player defended himself to Rolling Stone, claiming that he actually didn't remember the incident ever happening. He also claimed he didn't recall giving a lot of his interviews for the book. Sixx said the interviews were conducted in 2000, a year before he went into rehab, and a year in which he was allegedly going through a particularly rough patch with his drug and alcohol intake. Will we ever know whether the incident actually happened? Probably not, but it's one of those moments when you really hope the person is lying. The Dirt introduces Mick Mars when the guitarist shows up for an audition, outplays the blonde guitarist, and promptly fires the guy when Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee can't work up the nerve to do it.
Really?
As Ultimate Classic Rock reports, there's no proof this ever happened. We imagine the scene was included to establish Mars as a detached, cynical veteran. However, it just so happens that Motley Crue did originally flirt with another guitarist before Mars came along. But Greg Leon was a far cry from the sad sack we see in the film. He was a well-known singer and multi-instrumentalist in the Los Angeles hard rock scene. Lee was a huge fan of his. In fact, he ended up joining Leon's band Sweet 19 for a year and a half. In 2017, Leon claimed that Lee had wanted him to join Motley Crue early on, but he was reportedly uninterested because of Sixx's involvement. Basically, he thought Sixx was a terrible musician. He also didn't like that Sixx was intent on recruiting a frontman because he was sick of sharing lead vocal duties. Motley Crue and Leon went their separate ways, but the guitar player didn't exactly fade into obscurity. He became Randy Rhoads' replacement in Quiet Riot, played with Dokken, and fronted a number of other bands too. So that's that. But one more thing before we go. You know what else wasn't included in the Dirt? This commercial.
If you have a touch-tone phone, call us on the Motley Crue hotline, 1-900-932-8-CRUE.
Although most music biopics tend to offer up conventional retellings of their subject's life and times, Rocketman proudly identifies as an epic musical fantasy, where the more conventional parts of the story are intertwined with musical numbers and dreamlike, choreographed sequences. Of course, this approach comes at a price, and a few vital aspects of Elton John's story are noticeably missing from the final film. One of the most glaring omissions in the first third of Rocketman is Long John Baldry, an integral part of Elton's life who is nonetheless nowhere to be found. In case you don't know, Baldry was a popular musician of the time who enlisted Elton's band Bluesology as his backing band before Elton left to shape his own destiny. Baldry is a significant character in the Elton John story partly because from 1967 to 1969, the very much closeted Elton was in a relationship with a woman named Linda Woodrow. The two were scheduled to get married, but Elton grew increasingly desperate and unhappy in the relationship, even at one point contemplating taking his own life. That's when Baldry stepped in, telling Elton to put aside his suicidal thoughts, embrace his sexuality, and call off the wedding. Although Elton didn't fully come out of the closet, he still took the advice. In fact, Baldry's influence loomed so large that he and Bernie Taupin later immortalized his advice in the 1975 song Someone Saved My Life Tonight. Rocketman depicts a slightly diluted version of this story, but gives Baldry's crucial role to Taupin. While this is somewhat understandable since the lyricist was present during Baldry's pep talk, it's still strange that the movie chooses to completely omit a man who so heavily influenced Elton John's formative years. At its core, Rocketman is a story about family and the quest for familial love. Elton John's difficult relationships with his mother and father receive copious screen time, and the members of his extended family are depicted in their droves. His grandmother here, his stepfather there, and there's even a scene featuring his young half-brothers from his estranged father's new marriage. When John patches things up with Bernie Taupin at the end of the movie, their mended relationship is underlined when Taupin specifically identifies himself as John's brother. With such emphasis on family and brotherhood, brotherhood, it's a little odd that the movie doesn't even bother mentioning that Elton actually does have a half-brother from the family he actually grew up with. Elton's mother, Sheila Fairbrother, and his stepfather, Fred, have a son named Frederick, who is conspicuously absent from Rocketman. Seen as the movie makes it clear that Fred Fairbrother is a reasonably stand-up guy and a supportive stepfather to Elton, you'd think his son with Elton's mother would at least warrant a mention. As Bohemian Rhapsody's Paul Printer will tell you, a music biopic needs an antagonist, whether or not its hero actually had one. Rocketman's bad guy is John Reed, the sharp-dressed, handsome businessman who seduces Elton John and takes over as his manager before Elton gets the chance to find out what a cold, calculating monster he really is. But Rocketman eventually allows Reed to shimmer out of focus as it shifts its focus to the real villain of the story, addiction. But real life, as always, is another matter. The actual John Reed was virtually joined at the hip with Elton for 3 decades, first as a lover and then as a manager. This ended in a bitter court battle in 2001 after some of Reed's correspondence leaked to the press and Elton became convinced that the manager had turned into a mismanager. Reed eventually paid Elton a $2.54 million settlement, and the latter cut all connections to his longtime associate to the point that he ended up pretending that Reed didn't exist at all. Rocketman goes to some lengths to portray Elton John as a man who is always alone, even when he's surrounded by people. After he becomes Elton John, his lyricist, Bernie Taupin, is pretty much the only positive force in his life right up until he decides to get sober. While this is no doubt true in a sense, it implies that Elton had no real friends to speak of. But this is patently untrue. In fact, Elton had some very famous friends indeed. For example, Elton was very close friends with Queen's Freddie Mercury, who was ironically portrayed in a similar fashion in 2018's Bohemian Rhapsody. Even in his final days, Mercury took the time to arrange the delivery of a particularly thoughtful Christmas present to Elton, a painting by one of his favorite artists. Another good rock friend of Elton's is Rod Stewart, who has known Elton for 5 long decades. Like all great mates, the pair regularly snipe at each other with humor, elaborate practical jokes, and cutting insults.
They wanted me to make Christmas albums and, cover albums, Motown records, but that is so silly, I'll leave that to Rod Stewart and people like that.
Mercury and Stewart also knew each other, and the trio got along so well that they once briefly considered forming a drag trio called Nose, Teeth, and Hair. Rocketman isn't particularly big on the concept of Elton John's bisexuality. In the movie, he tries his hand at passing himself off as bisexual for all of one scene, and his musician drinking buddies almost immediately dismiss the very idea. This could be a nod to Elton's out and proud attitude and status as a gay icon today, but in real life, his closeted phase lasted slightly longer. In fact, he didn't come out until 1976, and even when he did, it was as a bisexual. He didn't officially come out as a gay man until 1988, when he divorced Renata Blowell. To be fair, Elton had certain professional reasons to keep that closet door closed, and the movie uses the villainous John Reed to stealthily convey them. In one scene, Reed outright tells the enamored Elton that they must keep their relationship secret because the backlash from the reveal could end him. Indeed, when the musician gave his I'm Bi interview in 1976, his album sales temporarily dropped. If nothing else, Rocketman is really very honest about the many, many vices of Elton John. In fact, Taron Egerton's Elton pretty much starts the movie by rattling off his assorted addictions and issues. Despite this ready admission of his many weaknesses, there's one that even this movie doesn't dare touch: soccer, or as Elton would call it, football. Elton has followed his favorite club, Watford FC, since childhood. As time progressed and his finances allowed, he moved from the mild stuff, that is, simply watching matches as a fan and booster of the team, to harder substances. In this case, actually buying the club and sitting as its chairman on 2 different occasions. Elton's involvement in Watford FC is considerably more relaxed these days, though he's still the honorary chairman for life and has a stand at the club's stadium named after him. It's fairly understandable why this side of Elton didn't make it into Rocketman. After all, a hearty game of soccer midway through might have disrupted the film's attempt to portray a drug-fueled, tortured artist. John Lennon's role in Rocketman is somehow both much larger and much smaller than it was in Elton John's actual life. In the movie, Lennon is the inspiration for the John part of Elton John, when the star only has the Elton part down and has to quickly improvise a surname. This anecdote isn't true in the slightest, however. The John actually refers to Long John Baldry, but the film also completely ignores the fact that Lennon was very much a part of Elton's life. The 2 superstars knew each other very well. In fact, they were such good friends that Lennon's last onstage performance before his death was at an Elton John show in 1974, an appearance made due to a lost bet. However, the famously acerbic Lennon was enough to make even Elton John nervous. While the ex-Beatle was never anything but pleasant toward the Rocketman, Elton has since admitted he was rather intimidated by Lennon's reputation as an abrasive guy toward people close to him. Long-term soulmates are a rare thing in any avenue of life, let alone in the notoriously fickle music industry. Perhaps that's why Rocketman leans so hard on the relationship between Elton John and Bernie Taupin, one that was as vital to Elton's story in real life as it is in the movie.
He's never said to my face, I'm not sure about that, even though there must have been times when he thought, oh, I didn't think it should turn out like that. He's been brilliant. We've never had an argument.
Rocketman also makes a point of emphasizing the way their business and personal relationship falls apart at the seams when Elton's assortment of addictions get the better of him. In the movie, Taupin leaves their partnership a couple of times, once at the height of their fame, as the partying becomes too much for him, and again near the end of the movie when Elton's partying becomes too much for him. He doesn't return after that second time until Elton seeks help for his addictions and promptly restores the artist's confidence with some brotherly words and a stack of fresh lyrics. While it's true that the real Elton and Taupin had a time out at one stage of their career, it was a significantly more mundane affair than the movie would have you believe. The pair broke up for a period in the late 1970s, but this was chiefly so they could collaborate with other people for a while, and they were soon back at work together. As for the second breakup, Taupin fully admits they had a creative slump in the late 1980s and early 1990s, but this wasn't because they had broken up, it was simply because they had a lot of stuff going on and weren't communicating enough. Elton John's piano skills might be world-class, but as with most artists, it's his voice that's the real star of the show. As such, it's curious that Rocketman completely ignores one of the most dramatic events of his 1980s, his surgery-induced voice change. Imagine the shock if Freddie Mercury had suddenly started singing with a completely different voice. Well, this strange scenario actually happened to Elton in 1987, when spasmodic bouts of pain forced him to seek medical help. As a result, something was removed from his vocal cords. The exact nature of his ailment has been speculated to have been throat cancer, described by his team as non-malignant lesions, and described by Elton himself as cancerous whatever. Whatever the culprit, the operation altered Elton's voice in a way that greatly pleased the man himself but disheartened a portion of his fans. And while Elton could now sing more fully than ever before, he had lost some of the falsetto that had helped make him famous. Rocketman's only nod to the existence of British royalty comes in the form of a quick aside where a character notes the Queen Mother is an Elton John fan. While this is certainly no mean feat for an artist, it also deftly sidesteps the fact that Elton has been hobnobbing with the royals pretty much ever since he had his breakthrough. Elton has been a member of the royal family's inner circle since 1970, when the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret first took a liking to his music. He became friendly with Princess Margaret to the point where they often attended art events together and even danced jive with Queen Elizabeth herself on at least one occasion.
And then the Queen came in and she said, "Can we join you?" And I said, "Say no, f*** off, right?"
In 1981, he added Princess Diana to his friendship notebook, and later her sons as well. For decades, Elton has been a permanent fixture on the royal family's guest list, save for a slight hitch in 1997, when his involvement with Gianni Versace's lewd photography book Rockin' Royalty sent him into a temporary deep freeze with the family. That same year, though, John performed his updated version of Candle in the Wind at Diana's funeral.